Good evening, everybody. As Justin said, I'm Remy, and the talk here, this talk is going to get a little weird. There's going to be a little participation. There's going to be a lot of group activities, things along those lines. We have a huge group, so I'm not going to do quite as many of the group activities as I normally might. But this is going to be a talk that is, in a lot of ways, about being creative in ways we usually don't think about being creative in IT. So to get us started, I'm just going to ask that everybody, for just one moment, close your eyes, take a deep breath, let it out. We're going to just get ready to kind of be creative. One more time, deep breath, and out. And when I talk about technical storytelling, I end up always thinking about one of my old bosses. Because I had this old boss, and this was at a company that wasn't really an IT company, so I was one of those developers who looked like I was a genius, not because I'm a particularly brilliant or smart developer, but because everybody else had last touched a mainframe 30 years ago and didn't really have a good foundation on modern technology. So I looked like a genius, and every time I met my boss for my performance review, that was very much the form our conversation would take. It would always be, Remy, you do such a great job with all of the development stuff. And all of these things on your performance review, we're going to give you these gold stars. And then we get to your communication skills, and we're going to say, you don't get a gold star on that. That's going to give you a needs improvement. And I thought that was a little weird. I wasn't quite sure what my boss meant with that. And I thought about it for a little while and said, well, you know what? I like giving presentations. I like giving talks. We have this user group for technology, so I'm going to start giving a lot of talks about new technologies we can adopt, new things we can do, new best practices we can start using. And I started signing up to give these talks, and in my first year I gave 2 or 3 of those. Everybody comes up afterwards, that was a great talk, we loved it, such a great idea. People started using some of the technology that I suggested we use. We migrated some of our database stuff to use some more modern programming techniques, things like that. So I'm really excited for my next performance review. I'm like, I'm going to get that gold star on communication skills. And we sit down, it's like, you did a great job with all of the programming stuff, but again, your communication skills, I'm going to say, needs improvement. And I'm like, why? I don't understand why. So I double down, right? I do even more presentations. The next year I do 5 or 6 presentations. I start getting invited to these meetings to help set policies, and I start laying out some new policies that we want to adopt in our organization, and people start using the policies I suggested. And I'm like, this is fantastic. I have totally got this. Next year comes around, go to my performance review. Once again, programming, you did such a great job on all of the technical skills, but communication skills, we're going to say, needs improvement. So again, I go through the next year. I'm just looking for every opportunity to look like I know what I'm doing when it comes to communication skills, because I don't understand why I keep getting that. And before my 3rd performance review comes around with this boss, he's going to move to another department. So I'm never going to have that other performance review with him. So I go and I hunt him down, and I'm like, all of those performance reviews, why did you tell me that my communication skills needed improvement? And he had 2 reasons, as it turned out. First, for the performance review, he has to mark something as needs improvement. So that was what he picked. And the other thing was, the reason he picked that was because I didn't send enough emails. I only sent emails out if I had an actual status update. If I had some news, I would send an email. But if I didn't have any news, I wouldn't send an email. And as a manager, he didn't really care for that. So that always got me thinking about the way we communicate in IT and the way we work with others in IT. And when we get into software development, how software development itself is really an act of communication, right? And it's an act of communication that happens on a large number of different levels. Because when I write code, the most obvious thing I'm communicating with is a computer, or a set of computers, or whatever, somebody's cell phone. I'm writing code that communicates with a machine. I'm telling a machine, do this set of things. And I've got a lot of ways I can describe how I want them to do that set of things, but I'm communicating, do this set of things. But I'm not just communicating with a computer. I'm communicating with other human beings. I'm communicating with my fellow developers, right? They're going to look at this code 6 months from now, and they're going to come and hunt me down and say, are you an idiot or are you insane, right? And then I look at my code and I say, I probably was just being an idiot because this is terrible and I'm very sorry I wrote this way. But ideally, when we're writing good code that communicates well with human beings as well. And that whole carry-through with communication carries into not even just how we build our software, but how we decide what software to build, right? There's that whole requirements gathering process. You know, the new-ish, not really that new, but the new-ish trend is to do things like gather user stories, right? To build up, and we even use the word story, even though they're not really much of a story. It's just, as some kind of user, I need this so that I can do my job, right? But there's this whole idea that we have a lot of communication. And one of the things that I've found is I've done a lot of presentations. I do a lot of technical training. As Justin mentioned, I'm a consultant, and as part of that, I do a lot of technical training. I do a lot of teaching. Recently, I taught a bunch of nuclear engineers how to use Python because they use that for a lot of their data, or they wanted to use that for a lot of their data analysis. One of the things I have found as I've done a lot of those sorts of talks and presentations and taken a week to teach a bunch of nuclear engineers Python and things like that, one of the things that I've found is that the techniques that help people tell good stories, whether they're writing prose, whether they're giving a talk, whether they're performing as a, don't want to compare it to stand-up, but spoken word sort of performances, those structures that are used to tell those stories can help us make technical talks more exciting, more memorable, and also a lot easier to understand. It really helps. I've worked a lot with managers who were not technical people, and it really helps quite a bit when I'm able to say things, to apply storytelling techniques, to explain technical concepts in a way that they understand without actually dumbing things down. Because that's the one thing I always hate, right? When you have to try and dumb it down, it's like, well, it's sort of like a switch, except it's a switch that is going to trip me with this cable. There we go. I really have to stop pacing. So overall, that's kind of my big idea for the purpose of this talk and sort of our main goal. And to that end, we're gonna talk a lot about some of the different kinds of stories. We're going to talk a lot about me really trying to control this cable. Oh, look at that, I'm all tangled. Pardon me. There we go. We're going to talk a lot about some of the important storytelling techniques, and we're going to have a focus on how we can apply those techniques specifically to stories about technology. Because when we go and somebody wants to go watch a movie, right? They don't want a movie that is all about the nuances of how bytes move from little endian to big endian when you use this protocol. They want a movie about characters, and they want a movie that's about people. When we talk about technical things, we often don't have those, but there's still a few techniques we can use that will make non-technical audiences be entertained, and it will help technical audiences also really engage with what you want to communicate. So before we start digging into any of that, does anybody have any questions for me about any of the ideas, any thoughts of your own on this? Or?
Why didn't your manager give you an action plan on how to improve your communication before 2.5 years?
Well, I may have alighted some details just to make the story entertaining. I didn't dumb it down, I just left out the parts that didn't really matter. It was always like, you need to send more emails. That was always, and I was just never good at it because I can't force myself to send an email just to say nothing has changed in the past day. Which, by the way, nobody steal this idea, but my $1 million startup idea. I'm going to build a tool with a couple of sliders and a few fields that you fill out. You give it your manager's email address, and it will send out meaningless status updates that say nothing's actually happened, and it'll just do that automatically every day with a little random generated text. It'll always look different. It'll look like you put a lot of work into it, But all you have to do is like set a slider to say, be positive, be negative. No, nobody steal that.
If you have all 10 items are green, then you're still good.
If you can boil everything down to that stoplight, that makes pointy-haired bosses really happy. Yep. I did have, getting off topic, but I did have this application that had like a stoplight dashboard, and the users didn't like the business rules for calculating which color to use. So we actually would constantly get change requests to change the logic so that things that were normally going to end up being yellow because it was out of spec, suddenly were now in spec, so they would show up as green. And they would constantly change the rules on us because their boss saw yellow and was really upset with them. It was, yeah. So that actually is a good example. When we talk about technical stories, there's an infinite number of kinds of stories. And when we're talking about technical stories, that's got its own separate set of infinite options. But there are a few core kinds of stories. The ones I've used, they've all been kind of built out of personal experience. I haven't really delved into anything super deeply technical. But these stories kind of fall into the category of what I like to call kind of street cred stories, right? I always like to have a few stories like this ready in the back of my head when I'm meeting a new client. I've used this same sort of style when I'm interviewing for a new job, although I tend to be a little more positive in those, right? Because you want everybody to feel good about themselves. But when we talk about the kinds of things we can communicate with technical stories, in addition to stuff like our street cred stories, one of my big ones and one of my personal specialties is just technique or technical adoption sorts of stories. The sorts of stories where we say, currently we do this, but there's this new technique or this new tool that we could use, and if we used it, then we would do this. And you can build a story around that. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the flow of how we could build stories like that. But there's also things like relating a story, I always like to call it, the rubber duck debugging thing, right? As soon as you look at a problem and build a story around that problem, even if you haven't solved it yet, that very often helps you build up to solving that problem. For another good career advancement sort of story pattern is the, and I just looked at it in my notes and there it is. After action reports, right? Goes back, this is the pointy-haired boss sorts of communication, right? I heard somebody over there talking about Agile earlier, and you always have your sprint reviews and sprint retrospectives, where almost in a lot of ways you're trying to build a narrative of what you accomplished in the past sprint, either for the team or for the other stakeholders. The idea is what happened, how can we communicate the results, project success and project failures, those project close meetings. When you get called at 4 in the morning to fix a production issue, the next morning somebody's going to ask what happened. These sorts of techniques can really help other people understand them and can help you look really good, which is always something to have in the back of your head. So to that end, what I want everybody to do for a moment is think about a situation you've been in that has some sort of stakes. And you don't even have to limit yourself right now to something that's technical. But think of a situation that you've been in where there was something on the line. A moment where you felt really excited about a possible opportunity, or where you were very afraid that you've just made a terrible mistake. What's the worst mistake you've ever made? What is one of the biggest problems you've ever solved? What is a huge issue that you resolved? What was it about the issue that you were the right person to solve it versus somebody else who was in the same place? Think about situations where you really felt like your job was on the line. Think about situations where you saw some new thing and wish somebody else saw how cool that new thing was. Think about situations where you just really, really wanted to throw a coworker down a flight of stairs, metaphorically, not physically. Think about situations where your coworkers wanted to throw you down a flight of stairs. Again, metaphorically, not physically. I have had coworkers throw me down a flight of stairs, but I was a teenager at the time. That doesn't count. Think about situations where you just felt as happy with the situation as you possibly could have been. And compare that to those times that you knew that things were just wrong. These sorts of situations where you have some sort of big investment in what's going on, it doesn't have to be a big emotional investment. Think about those sorts of situations. Think about a system you've built recently. Think about all of the moving parts in that system and how they interact. I'm kind of listing these off quickly. I normally like to have a bit more of a pause, but we've got a kind of compressed schedule here. What I want to get at, though, and this is far from an exhaustive list, there are a lot of experiences you have. Every day you have a lot of experiences that are the fuel for telling a story. And so again, just take a few moments, think about some of those options. Because in a moment I'm going to ask you to do something a few of you might not want to do. Because here's what I'd like to do next. And you don't have to have a really solid idea yet. But what we're going to do is I want everybody to turn to one of their neighbors. We're going to pair everybody off. And here's what I'd like you to do, just in a little group of two, and if we have an odd number, I will make it an even number. But in groups of two, I'd like you to just take turns. Take about 5 to 10 minutes. One of you tell some story, some personal experience story. It can be about some system you've built. It can be a very deeply technical story. Just think about those situations that are sort of big things that you really feel strongly about. And so pair off, take 5 or 10 minutes, tell a story. I'll let you know when about 10 minutes have gone by, and then we'll switch, and the other person in the pair is going to tell a story. And don't all jump up at once. Everybody make a new friend. A few more things I want to talk about, and after I talk for a little bit longer, what I really want to do is, with whatever time we've got, you guys, everybody here is just practice telling a story. And there are a lot of you here, so there's no way we're going to have the opportunity to get everybody up to tell a story. But by the end of the workshop, after I talk a little bit longer and give you some ideas for ways to maybe polish or tweak what you were just practicing, I want to get as many people as we can kind of get up to do that in front of an audience, get some practice, and get some feedback from your fellow students, what they liked about it and what they didn't. So now that you've practiced it once, that's something to keep in mind for what's coming up in the future. Now, let me find my spot. There we go. Now, when we're telling a story, it's easy to just be like, here's a set of things that happened. And that often works out to not be a super entertaining story to a lot of people. There are a few things we can do to help make our stories more entertaining, and also that will help us both keep the story on track and remember where we're going with it, and also remember how to fit in all of the key points we want to actually fit in. So for example, we have, kind of in the same way we have design patterns, we have the basic pattern of a story. And this pattern is not meant to be a prescription that every story is going to fall into this pattern, but it works really well. It's the same pattern that Shakespeare's plays used and most movies you watch use, and the reason they use them is because it works pretty well. And that structure is known as the 5-act structure or the 5-beat structure. And the first beat is our exposition, right? We tell the audience the world as it is. And when we're telling a personal story, we're going to start with a position like the story I was telling at the beginning. I was working and I had performance reviews with my boss. And right there, you know a lot about even just the corporate environment. I didn't give you a lot of detail there, but right there, it tells you where I was at, what was going on around me. You saw the big picture. That tells you here's what the world looks like. In our second beat, we have the inciting event. And this is often one of our very short beats. This is the moment where things have changed. My boss says, you did a great job on all of these technical skills, but your communication skills need improvement. That's the moment when things change. For me as a character, for me as a person, that was a big moment for me in that interaction. That was my inciting event. Then you go through the rising action. Given this change, given this disruption to my event, or to my world, I'm now going to take a series of steps to react to that. And the world is going to change, and I'm going to change, and things are going to happen. This is that rising action section. I went out and gave presentations. Didn't get the changes I wanted. I started joining some of the committees at work and setting policies. Didn't get the changes that I wanted. Eventually you hit the climax. You hit the point where things can't keep going on the way they have. The moment of maximum tension, right? When I finally confront my boss, what did you mean when you said I needed to improve my communication skills? And then you work into your resolution. You take that tension, you bring it to some natural conclusion, and you give the audience a little sense of what the world looks like now. In my case, it was I started sending a few more emails than I normally might. That 5-act pattern, like I said, it's a great pattern because it works for pretty much any story you might want to tell, but it also works really well for one of my favorite kind of subsets of stories. And I mentioned the idea of introducing a new technique or a new tool to use. Whenever I try and drive change in an organization, as a consultant now, people have already decided they wanted to change by the time they're talking to me. But when I was working like a 9-to-5 job, and I'm like, guys, we're really doing this the hard way. We have so many better options for accomplishing our goals. One of the ways I would help drive change, and I had a lot of success with this, was taking this story structure. The exposition is, this is what the world looks like right now. Like really, this is what we're doing at work right now. The inciting event is, let's introduce this new tool that we could use. The rising action is, now I'm going to show you all of the ways things that were hard before become easy now because we've introduced this new tool. We've gone from doing manual deployments to doing automated deployments, for example. And if we build this tool or get this tool set up to use to do automated deployments, here's what our world starts to look like. And I build up to a natural climax of, and here's this big problem that we've always had challenges, and now my protagonist of the story is this new technology. This protagonist now overcomes the challenges, and we have this new world that, in my resolution, I describe a little bit about what it looks like. That pattern, again, it works really, really well, and it's very effective. It works for technical stories, but one of the things that I just did in that last example, and this is one of the huge tips, this is probably one of the biggest things to remember for telling technical stories. One of the huge tips is that I made a technology the main character. When we listen to stories, when we watch movies, read books, etc., what do we want to see? We really want to see people, right? Nobody wants to see a movie where nobody has any sort of emotional reaction to anything, right? The new Star Wars trilogy, right, is a big example of that because nobody really has any realistic emotions in that. They all just kind of say their lines and walk off camera eventually. We don't like to see things that really feel like they're robots. We like people like Data because, even while Data from Star Trek looks and acts like a robot, there's sort of this relatable core to it, right? When we're telling technical stories, there's a literary technique known as personification, right? We can take a non-human thing and talk about it like a person. And I can all of a sudden start ascribing all sorts of personality traits to things that aren't people. For example, who here's worked with the Oracle database? So if I were to say the Oracle database is very much like one of those overbearing sorts of parents. Not only do they not really care about how you feel about things and they want you to feel about them the way that they want you to feel about them, they also tend to do a lot of the, if you don't know what's wrong, I'm not going to tell you. Like you run a query and it's not using that index you built, you do the explain plan and it'll tell you it's not using the index, but why isn't it using the index? If you don't know, it's not going to tell you, right? And even if you haven't worked with Oracle, you get an immediate sense. I've done a lot of Oracle workshops, and in pretty much all of them, the first thing I lead off with is that Oracle hates you and wants you to suffer. Which the Oracle software product does not actually care about you, right? It doesn't actually know that you exist. It's just a piece of software. But by giving it these sorts of human traits, and these are very honest, accurate traits, especially if you've ever worked with forms and reports. Oracle forms and reports are absolutely miserable. It gives the audience something to latch onto. It gives something that isn't a person, personality. And that's one of those key tricks to helping your technical stories come alive. It's important for any story to have characters in your story, but helping a technical story come alive really works if you start treating your technology almost like it were people. The other big thing to help a story come alive and to be memorable, and sorry, I'm also trying to keep track of my time here. To help a story come alive and be memorable and something the audience is going to enjoy is the addition of sensory detail, right? You don't just say, you know, John walked into the room. You say John walked into the red room perhaps, right? Even just a small detail like that can help make things more interesting. And that particular sensory detail is one of the most obvious ones, right? When as human beings, one of the first senses we tend to go to is sight, right? What did you see? What color is something? What shape is it? You know, is it shiny? Is it not shiny? Those sorts of visual details are one of the most powerful sorts of sensory images because that's how most of us interact with the world, right? The first thing we do when we're trying to get to know somebody is we are looking at them, right? We're making eye contact. We're trying to figure out how this person works. Seeing is such a huge thing. So, you know, perfect example. Don't just tell us what happened. Show it to us. Tell us the visual sights that one might see as something's happening. Walk us through that event. If I wanted to maybe tweak the story about my manager, I could add that visual detail of his goatee that he had. He had those little Van Dyke mustache goatee sorts of combos, but he never really properly got the rest of his face shaved, so he'd always have these weird little patches that would show up and kind of move around his face as the week went on and as he trimmed and missed different spots. And right there, visual detail, now you know more about my boss. He had this weird kind of like bowl cut with a part sort of haircut. Visual detail makes it a little more interesting. Hearing things, right? The sense of hearing. What do things sound like? That particular boss, for example, he had a very thick Yinzer accent, right? Little West Virginia mixed in too, but it was more predominantly a Yinzer sort of accent. So it was always funny, he had that very nasal, clipped tone. A little detail like that, again, helps make this character a little more real. Actually, a better example for him, the sound I associate with him more than anything was his typing. Because for whatever reason, he typed like a jackhammer. If his door was open to his office, you knew if he was in it or not because he was typing. If you didn't hear typing, you knew he wasn't in his office. You didn't even need to go down the hall. You're just like, is my boss there? No, he's not. I'll just wait for him to get back before I pop in. So sound, what we hear, obviously such a huge sense of touch, right? How things feel. You know, that slick feeling you get on a well-worn keyboard, right? That's one of my favorite feelings, that keyboard that's been really broken in over the past like 15 years. I love that feeling, those smooth, like the keycaps have been wiped off because people have used it for so long. I just love the way that feels. And that sort of textural detail, again, we're making the scene come alive. Is the room hot? Is the room cold? That's something that you're going to feel, right? That's not exactly a touch, but it's still that sense of a physical sensation. Smell. This company actually was a coatings company, so managers basically got free paint to repaint their offices whenever they wanted. So every once in a while, all of the managers would kind of repaint their offices. So one of those performance reviews, it had just been repainted. It was turned into this dark blue color, and you have that smell of all of the solvents in the paint, that plasticky vinyl sort of smell. So sight, sound, taste, and smell. These are the big ones that we normally think of, right? I mean, these are some of those big senses. Taste, obviously. Those are the big five. Kind of skipped over taste because taste in a lot of ways sort of falls under smell, right? And generally when we're talking about, like, for example, if I'm telling you a story about work, I'm probably not going to be talking to you about what my boss tastes like. On the flip side, I can tell you what the coffee tastes like, right? Because programmers are machines that turn coffee into code. And we actually had good coffee there, and it was free, believe it or not. It's always nice. Except the espresso. The espresso was free, but it wasn't good. The espresso machine we had. I know, first world problems, right? Our espresso machine was kind of bad. It made bad espressos. So terrible, suffered so much. So those five senses are the key senses that we normally think of. But there are two more that are big ones. And the first one, and this sort of, I picked this one up from actually a gentleman named Kevin Allison. He runs the Risk podcast, which is a storytelling podcast. It's actually a very dirty, lewd sort of storytelling podcast. People tell stories that you would not tell your mother. But I learned this next two from him. And the first one is the feeling body, right? It's not just your sense of touch and your sense of smell, but it's your feeling body. It's that crick you get in your neck when you've been hunched over the keyboard for too long. It's that feeling you get when after that you stand back up. It's that sense, that sinking feeling you get in your stomach when your boss is like, you need to come see me now. That sinking feeling. Those are the sorts of details that you can get and add as feeling body details. That sense of being a living person, right? You are in this body. You feel all of these things going on. You often don't think about them. Right now, for example, I think I actually broke something in my foot a month ago, and it never quite healed. So, like, my left foot constantly hurting. It's one of these things. It's always in the back of my head. And if I'm telling somebody about giving this workshop a month from now, I very well might. One of the things I might mention is the way that I had that kind of soreness as I'm shifting my weight around. You see, I like to pace. I'm very aware of that right now. And the other one, and this one actually I feel is almost the most obvious one for a technical story, the thinking mind, right? Not only are you inside of this body that is constantly providing you with information, all sorts of things you feel about your body and all sorts of reactions it has to the world, you have this thinking mind as well. You can have inside of your brain all of those sensations of solving a problem, right? Think about that time that you had that intractable bug and it turned out somebody had misplaced a semicolon, that somebody was probably you. And there's a feeling you get in your brain when that sort of thing happens. Or that satisfaction of seeing a puzzle and seeing the solution. And just suddenly, when it comes to you, that sense of relief, your brain just latches onto the solution and you feel so accomplished. And there's even that feeling body reaction too, right? Because there's that lightness you get in your whole body when you're like, I figured that out. Those sorts of details, even just very small amounts of them, really help take a story that is kind of to something that your audience and that the people you're talking to, whether they're your coworkers, whether they're non-technical people, whether they're your boss, it makes that sort of thing come alive. And when we're talking about technical stories, just like I can use personification to make the technical components in a story come alive, I can use metaphor to make those same technical components provide sensory feedback. Everybody's heard the phrase code smells, right? Code smell. When code is bad, we talk about how it has that smell, needs to be refactored in some fashion. That right there, it's just a metaphor, but you can start using those same ideas to take technical components, talk about the noises they make. The Oracle database doesn't really, itself actually make a lot of noises, but it does grumble a lot, right? There's this constant grumble from it as it's, reevaluating all of it does all of this stuff internally. It's constantly doing all the statistics gathering, and there's this grumble associated with that because it always has to make sure somebody knows that it's working as hard as it is. So know that. Those sorts of details really, really help take a story from being something that is just a collection of facts to being something that people are going to feel strongly about, that they're going to react to. Questions on any of these ideas? Any thoughts or reactions to this? A blue shirt, sorry. I didn't get to learn everybody's names because there's so many of you, but.
I've been accused before of rambling when I tell stories.
Mm-hmm.
And some of what you're describing sounds a little rambly.
There's definitely a balance. I'm personally, I know I'm being a little bit rambly as I relate these facts, and I also tend to get a little bit rambly. But when you go back to that idea of having that clear story structure, right, those 5 beats, these details almost kind of become the I don't want to use the term spices, but I'm going to anyway. They become kind of the spices that take this just implementation of a pattern and turn it into kind of more of a creative expression. And so one thing is if you add too many details, you're going to kind of cover up that clear structure, that beginning and ending pattern, and that's where it starts to feel kind of rambly for people, right? So when you're thinking about a story, it's always good to kind of rehearse, especially even like just for casual conversation, having kind of the practice in your head, running through it once, just in your head, to be able to walk through and keep track of all of the details versus the flow of the story from beginning to end. That is one of the things that can help with that. You definitely don't want to use too many details. Sorry, yes.
Audience interaction, thoughts, asking, throwing something out as part of the story, asking people to.
Absolutely. Even as I make my little like, who's seen this, right? Or you all know this. Things like that's a very simple example of audience interaction. But yeah, absolutely. Engage. This is all about engaging with people, especially when we're telling these stories in a professional setting, right? We're often going to be telling these around a conference table or maybe as part of a presentation to our peers. These sorts of situations, really, it does become super valuable to engage people. Helps make sure they're paying attention. Part of the reason I'm like, does anybody have any questions or thoughts on any of this, right? Because I want everybody to be engaged and invested in what I'm saying. So that's definitely a big part of it. So a few other thoughts of hands, yeah.
I'm going to ask for your answer, and I only have mine.
Okay.
What's the purpose of learning how to tell better technical stories?
The overall purpose, really, I'm a big fan, and as I kind of said at the top, I'm a big fan of thinking about software development in terms of being an active communication and the ability to tell stories more clearly, even if we're only telling them to ourselves. I really personally do feel that it does help make you a better programmer. It also makes you a better coworker. Makes you somebody more enjoyable to work with, because when I have a question and you start talking to me about it, you're going to be able to give me an answer that I'm going to be able to follow, even if I don't share the same technical background as you, right? So I always feel that the key benefit is going to be improving the way we communicate with each other.
Purpose.
Oh, purpose. What do you mean by purpose? Because my purpose is to get a benefit to me, so.
Why we're doing it. Why we're doing it. Not what we will benefit, but why are we doing it? Why would I invest in perfecting this craft?
My answer to that would, trying to word it without getting into benefit, But I would say at its core, it's another tool to help us communicate. That's, for me, really what it is. I'm curious what your answer is, since you said you had one.
The purpose is to get the appropriate action accomplished quickly. So
That's a much more specific way than what I had in my head. But yeah, I definitely, I would agree with that. But go ahead.
So part of what Remy presented was a pattern, a template, a beginner's level, with, in this case, no information about who you were presenting to. So if you've got a boss that only gives you 2 minutes, this doesn't work. So you have to tailor your story to get the action you want, the appropriate action quickly. So he gave you a generic example, but as a seasoned practitioner, you have to tailor that, synthesize something that's going to get the action you want quickly. So sometimes stories work, sometimes stories may not work, sometimes data works. So the purpose for people to consider this is to get the appropriate action quickly.
I like that way of looking at it, actually. I honestly had not, in my head, put it exactly that way, but that is a good way of looking at it. Following off on that, actually even getting into getting the appropriate action quickly, when we're communicating technical information, there are a lot of cases, right, where data is the right tool for the job. There are other cases where when you throw data, when you throw technical terms at people, they just turn into that deer in the headlights. You can see that they're hearing the words you're saying, but they're just bouncing off. Ping, 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 nothing's getting through. I like to refer to that as the technobabble effect, right? The technobabble effect is when you incorporate so many technical details in your communication that people who are not completely vested in the nuances of those technical details just gone. You've lost them completely. These various techniques really do help cut down on that technobabble effect. Treating your technical systems, like if I want to tell you a story about, say, very briefly, I'm gonna cut myself off in 2 more minutes. If I wanted to tell you guys about an application I built called Color Point, which was all about gathering color data from manufacturing plants. GM would paint a car, and they'd attach a scanner to the car and measure the color the car now was. And they would measure this through a set of 3-dimensional data points, and I had to build a technical system to capture that data. And I can talk to you all about the technical underpinnings, about how, since we were a .NET shop, we used WCF services and we had to build a full duplex service in order to communicate with a driver running on the local PC. And we had to use a click once deployment to actually launch a service on that PC so that we could actually have that service call up to our server and our server call back down. And I could walk through all of those sorts of technical details. And for a lot of people, that's just going to go, I don't really care that much. I don't care as much about the problem. But if I start applying some of these techniques to give these characters traits, I can talk about the scan client, which was a little bit of a fidgety sort of tool to build because we didn't have a solid picture of our deployment environment, because it's going to just run on employees' desktops, and that desktop could be anything. Including, we found when we were rolling this out to users, one of them had a 486. Yeah, they got a new computer. That was the fix for that one. So the scan client was a very fidgety little tool because the users didn't want an actual UI for the tool. They wanted to do everything in the web browser, and they wanted to talk to a physical piece of hardware on their machine from their web browser. So we built this click once thing called the scan client. They clicked a link in the web browser. In the background, it launches this application, and that application was a server itself. It was actually a self-hosting WCF service. And now that chats with only 2 things, their web browser and the actual scanning device that was attached to their machine. And notice I'm talking about how it chats with those things. It has a conversation with those things. Those are things humans do. That's not things software really does. But again, that metaphor, that personification. Earlier I described it as being fidgety, right? and I use the word fidgety, and that gives you a very clear picture of sort of how a person might behave if they're being fidgety, like they might be pacing back and forth in front of you for the entire night. So these sorts of tools help us find a path through. And I have one last key thing before I want to try and get some volunteers up here. It's almost 8:30, so we'll be running a little on the long side. But the other key element to this, to really help you manage the technobabble effect, is to identify what we would call the controlling idea. Because as much as we can break a story up into these 5 phases, right? We've got these 5 beats, and we know that we can add all sorts of sensory details or metaphors of sensory details to make these stories more interesting and memorable. That's going to start feeling really rambly unless we and the audience know what the point of the story is, right? And since I didn't have a point except to illustrate a few ideas of metaphors, that whole color point story probably felt a little bit on the rambly side, right? Because there was no clear controlling idea. Why was I telling you about that? Well, specifically, I was telling you about it because I wanted to give you some metaphor examples. But really, beyond that, I didn't have a good reason. There was no controlling idea. There was no purpose to the story. Whereas when I was talking about my event with the boss, the controlling idea, the theme of the story was the importance of communication, right? And it's even reflected in kind of the punchline, so to speak, of that story, where all of my added effort and all of my struggle arose because it was actually my boss who wasn't communicating clearly, right? You say, your communication skills are bad, but I didn't understand why. And then I found out what he really wanted. There's a clear controlling idea to that. Even early on, before I revealed the conclusion to the story, you understood this was about how I communicate. I as a person communicate. That controlling idea is the thread that's going to tie all of these pieces together. And that's sort of why I held off to the end, because this is my big finale. This is my big finish, by the way. We want to go and guide our user, or our audience, developer I mean, right? Call everybody a user. We want to guide our audience through those 5 beats of the story. We want to add details to help make the story more memorable. And the way we decide what details to include, how to express those details, is to make sure we know what the controlling idea for that story is. Sort of the purpose of the story, the theme, what the story is about. Does anybody have any, again, questions, thoughts, reactions to any of those ideas?
So you wouldn't really follow tell them what you're going to say it, tell them what you said, like you would in a more dry presentation. With storytelling, you need to maintain that element of sort of like surprise and denouement.
Yeah, I wouldn't focus as much on surprise because we can tell stories with no surprises in them that are still really entertaining. Good example, recently, right, pretty much everybody I think has seen Guardians of the Galaxy at this point. There really weren't any surprises in that story. We've seen that movie like 300 times already, except this time there was a raccoon in it. Even though there were no surprises in it, it still was entertaining. We still like to see how things develop. There was still suspense in that story. And yes, I have to be honest, even when I'm doing technical instruction, I actually don't use the 3 T's, which he was mentioning, tell them what you're going to say, tell it to them, then tell them what you just told them. It's not an inherently bad pattern, and there's a reason why that's generally given as a tool for instruction, is you want to introduce an idea, get the audience familiar with the idea, and then recap what you just did, so that way you're reinforcing those ideas. And there's a place for that, but I personally find, especially even when I'm doing instruction, I prefer to give the audience a path through the material. What was the last thing I was teaching? I was just teaching Ruby on Rails a few weeks back. And my approach to doing that was to identify, well, the controlling idea, right, is really in what ways is Ruby on Rails going to help their web development process? And they're a shop that currently does cold fusion, so there were a lot of ways that Ruby on Rails was going to help their development process. New York State Office of Mental Health, by the way. Make your own jokes about cold fusion and the Office of Mental Health. So the controlling idea is, in what ways is Ruby on Rails going to help their development process? And the story, which I told them over the course of 5 days, was working through all of the beats of how Ruby on Rails is going to help them solve problems. I introduced Ruby on Rails, I introduced how it helps them with web development, and then I just walked through. The rising action was, here's this technique you can use. Here's this other technique that you can use. So there was a lot of power and flexibility in that pattern without having to fall back on the 3 T's. The 3 T's, though, are a good, I almost want to say they're good training wheels, right? I feel it's even maybe a little too derogatory because they're not a bad technique. I just, for instruction, I have found that you can get a lot more mileage by kind of finding a narrative path through.
But there are some people that you may come across where that method actually works better. You know, they may be on that mindset.
Absolutely.
To use that format.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely want to say, like, this is the be-all and end-all, right? Especially we're doing this for an hour and a half this evening. There's only so much that we can accomplish. And storytelling, while it's a powerful technique, I do want to kind of stress, it's a tool in the toolbox. It is not the solution. I've seen a lot of people who give talks on how to be better presenters. And there's always this big, find the narrative for your presentation. There are plenty of presentations that really shouldn't have that. Not everything's a TED Talk, right? So yes, there are definitely places where you're going to find where data works better, where the 3 T's is a solid technique and the audience is going to respond to it better. A good pointer, I guess, for that is, and we're not going to work on this skill tonight, but that skill of active listening, right? Paying attention to your audience is a big part in figuring out whether or not they're following you where you're trying to go. Yeah. Does anybody have any other questions? Well, with all of that said, I think it's just past, it's just a little past 8:30. Who wants to be our first victim? Who wants to come up? It can be the same story you were practicing earlier. It can be a completely fresh story that you've been